This lecture is on comparative advantage with a few critiques. Okay, so we're going to begin with Adam Smith, who is the progenitor of absolute advantage, which David Ricardo, sometime later, evolved into comparative advantage. But let's begin with a vocal impersonator quoting Adam Smith and telling us what absolute advantage is.
The natural advantages which one country has over another in producing particular commodities are sometimes so great that it is acknowledged by all the world to be in vain to struggle with them. By means of glasses, hotbeds, and hot walls, very good grapes can be raised in Scotland, and very good wine too can be made of them, at about 30 times the expense for which at least equally good can be brought from foreign countries. Would it be a reasonable law to prohibit the importation of all foreign wines merely to encourage the making of claret and burgundy in Scotland?
Okay, so absolute advantage. And we may kind of note that the sort of most virile examples of absolute and comparative advantage are like agricultural, i.e. things that cannot be shifted easily from one part of the world to the other. A bit of an aggression, but in microeconomics you'll learn about perfect competition. And in perfect competition, when you get down to it, it's basically something that's applicable to some aspects, and even they're not exactly farms. So it's of note that a lot of economics is kind of more agricultural economics, though it's misapplied to businesses habitually.
Natural advantages which one country has over another.
There we go. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit more pedantically about absolute advantage. I'll tell you right now, I'm kind of mentioning this. If you are confused about the difference between absolute advantage and comparative advantage, do this. You have one good on one axis, another good on another axis, and then put the amount that each, just put the production possibilities frontier for each country. Graph both of them. If they cross like this, then it's absolutely absolute advantage. End of story. Okay. So, question, and take a moment to think about this. I'm not going to read the questions because you can. That's right, 80. Good. Easy, right? Scotland can produce more cloth than can France. And the converse is also true. Okay, pretty straightforward, right? Okay, so take a moment on that one. Hint, Scotland is producing all of the cloth. Okay. So, that was absolute advantage. Yeah, let's just go back to that slide just for a minute to let you reflect on it. Isn't that weird that the UK is pretty much like the west of France? Sorry, pretty much like to the north of France here. It's also kind of to the west, but if you look at like a bigger map, it's actually kind of north. Oh, okay, see, that's what I mean. For the longest time, I always thought of it as the north to the west of France, and still sometimes do. Okay, comparative advantage. So I haven't talked about this as much in microeconomics, which is what we're still on until we get to chapter 5. Almost everything is in terms of one time period. T is like the time period, and the time period here is 1 hour. Hence the small numbers, right? Um, this is like what's called a static or time static analysis. Microeconomics is predominantly conducted in this sort of analysis, whereas macroeconomics can be, but is far more likely to be in a time dynamic analysis, i.e., with changing time periods. Okay, pay attention to that in the lecture on the changes in the production possibility frontier. The part 2 video of the chapter 2 and 4 lecture. Those second parts is chapter 2. Okay, so we're now talking about not England and France, those two countries who dearly love each other, but instead, not. Instead, England and Portugal. Now, the first thing I want to point out to you again here, look at this. If it's in comparative advantage, these lines are no longer crossing. One country is dominant in both forms of production, so it's, you know, patently above the other one here. Okay, so just make sure you kind of understand this. Portugal can make 100 bottles of wine, or it can make 90 square yards of cloth. England can make 10 bottles of wine, or 80 square yards of cloth. Okay, I think I just told you that. By the way, when I'm doing these animations, I just like change them up each time going down the row just to keep it interesting. Okay, so this is kind of just checking to make sure you can read this graph correctly. So, okay, so the point here is absolute advantage isn't going to help us to know which country, quote, should, end quote, specialize in what, because the absolute advantage is held by only one country. Okay, here, opportunity cost. It is simply foregone benefit, and in this context, it means what Portugal had to give up, the trade off along its production possibility frontier to make 90 yards of cloth. Excuse me, to make 100 bottles of wine. If it makes 100 bottles of wine, the trade off or the opportunity cost is 90 square yards of cloth. That too is supposed to be a hyperscript, by the way. Note to check, change that. Okay. Uh, okay. So here's the question that we should be able to answer now. Okay. Understand opportunity cost, trade off. Make sure we do. It can have a more specific meaning. Well, I guess it actually here means the same thing. The next best thing that could be produced, assuming that production is optimized. Okay, here in this context, it just means the next best thing that could be produced, which is a little different, A, and B, which is actually a little bit problematic because what along here is the best or the worst. So actually, in this context, we're not talking about the next best thing that could be produced. That is not the opportunity cost. I'm not sure that this is made sufficiently clear in economics. In fact, there are a lot of problems. There are significant problems with this whole opportunity cost thing. But for this, all you have to know is that the opportunity cost is the of producing one thing or one combination of things is the trade-off in this too good world of producing the other or the other combination. Okay, I haven't showed you how to do comparative advantage yet. Just guess at this point. Okay, so we can kind of guess that it's probably England because it looks like England has to give up a lot less wine to produce cloth than does Portugal, and it doesn't produce very much less cloth than Portugal does either in so doing. So if, for example, Portugal were to produce 90 square yards of cloth and England were to produce 10 bottles of wine, the world would have 90 square bottles of cloth and 10 bottles of wine. Whereas if we use comparative advantage, you guessed it, the world gets 100 bottles of wine and 80 square yards of cloth. So it's gotten a lot more wine, we know that, and a little bit less cloth. So we might think, well, it's a little bit less cloth, right? So it must be better to use comparative advantage, have a little bit less cloth and a lot more wine. Actually, it would depend on how much cloth and wine are worth to the world. So we can't actually say that. We can't say that definitively. We cannot say that comparative advantage will make the world better off definitively. They rig examples in the textbook, explanations and demonstrations of comparative advantage, so you don't notice that. But this comes from the labor theory of value. They changed it to opportunity cost to make it smoother and to get rid of that because mainstream economics, of course, has rejected the labor theory of value. However, because this theory was formed using the labor theory of value, it doesn't have any meaning using the utility theory of value. And in fact, at one point, Chiang in the sixth edition, in talking about production possibilities frontier, says, well, economists don't really know where on the production possibilities frontier we could, we would produce if it were just one country's. Well, then that the same thing is true of comparative advantage. They just don't bother to mention that. If Chiang did, then kudos to him. That said, there is a way you can theoretically demonstrate it. I mean, it's true as Jiang said. They have no way to kind of like know for sure, but that's true of almost everything in economics. So that doesn't say much. So there's no real reason to not have introduced, other than it's more complex, a utility function in this, which is, I'm not going to get off on this, and I don't expect you to know this. Well, I do expect you to know for assessment purposes that because this is a labor theory of value and it comes from a labor theory of value and does not involve a utility theory of value, it is not actually necessarily the case. It sounds like Pareto efficiency or Pareto optimality again. It says that that things are not efficient that are not Pareto optimal, but that's a lie because they may or may not be efficient and often and could well be more efficient, even though it's Pareto inefficient, than a Pareto optimal outcome. Okay, so the analogy here is that we don't know whether comparative advantage will make the world better off or not. They rig examples to show you that, but It could be that the world likes cloth more than it does wine, so losing that 10 square yards of cloth is worse than gaining the 90 wine bottles. Okay, so take away from this, examples are rigged in this to show that the world is made off from comparative advantage, even though that is not necessarily the case. Okay, we don't know because we don't, at least in Chong's opinion, are uh, able to reasonably estimate the utility functions for these goods and services. Okay, right. But that doesn't change the fact that the comparative advantage for each of these countries is, given the parameters of that argument, the context in which the argument is made, that the comparative advantage in wine production is Portugal and in cloth production, England. Yeah, we're going to learn how to figure out comparative advantage more pedantically in a later slide, which I think is 11. This got a little edited since then, so we'll see. Okay, just some vocabulary for comparative advantage. Autarky, just an autarky is just a country that doesn't trade, or a condition that it doesn't trade. I mean, I guess you could have like an autarky in one good, it doesn't trade that one good. Terms of trade, it's just like, if we didn't have money, then people might exchange one quantity of one good for another quantity of another good. This is countries doing that. And the resulting ratio of exchange is terms of trade, TT. So easy way to tell the difference if you get confused, which I have on several occasions. That's another story. Okay, I'm just repeating what I said. We're going to actually get to a lecture on this, as before we begin really, getting into chapters 5 and 6 at the beginning about classical versus uh, micro or neoclassical economics, partly because of the terminology that Chiang is using, which is extremely confusing. I'm not saying that he's necessarily alone in using it, but it does require some explanation, and I am going to ask that we use a different vocabulary to describe these different periods of economic thought and contrary points of view. Big difference, though, you should know between classical and the very poorly named neoclassical or microeconomics is that microeconomics uses a utility theory of value, and Ricardo and the classical economists use a labor theory of value, though he comes at it differently than the other classical economists. Marx is a classical economist who some of you may be familiar with. I don't know. I was surprised in my class at the USDB, which maybe I'll bring up some other time, that I'd had there, that they actually were not aware of the labor theory of value. I'm not even sure, or even Karl Marx. Okay. Okay, so yeah, this is kind of formalizing what I'd already said. Um, with a rigged example, and of course, if we assume that more of a good is always better, because if it weren't, then simply saying we got more of these goods in the world is better off may not be true. Okay, pronunciation of this Austrian fellow. I love the Austrians, especially the early ones. Hate many of their conclusions, which they abandon their famous rationality and logical thinking to arrive at for ideological reasons, which tend to dominate this school. And by the way, the Austrian school is different than the neoclassical school or mainstream, which is orthodox economics. Kind of, this stuff is very unclear, but the UMKC, the economics taught at UMKC, if you are interested in Austrian economics, is definitely are all heterodox schools, whereas mainstream and neoclassical tend to be orthodox schools. Though, like the three different, well, like Adam Smith of the classical school, and neoclassical economics, Austrian economics comes to these same sort of essentially free market conclusions. Okay, so we're back again. That last slide, the only thing I really wanted you to get from that slide, and we're going to talk about it more later and even more in another lecture, is that if there is perfectly free capital mobility, then comparative advantage becomes pretty meaningless, especially if there are disequilibriums between wages in different countries. Just imagine that if every single productive input of one country, including climate, skills, and everything about it, could be transferred to another country, then each country and labor could move and everything would eventually become exactly the same. None would have any particular advantage in producing anything. And although that extreme condition is unlikely, um, ones that significantly enough approximated exists. For example, any kind of machine or skills or most any kind of things like that produced indoors. If transportation costs are low, which they are now, or low enough, then if there is much lower wages or less environmental regulation in one country as opposed to another that simply does not have as much capital, lacking a quote comparative advantage end quote, then that capital will just move to that country with the lower wages. It's not that comparative advantage is giving us more benefits so much, at least in the long run, which could be a decade or something, as that given free trade, capital will simply move to poorer countries where they have to pay employees less. And yes, it's cheaper, but it's not necessarily because it's more productive. It's because it's cheaper to produce there, and a negative market externality in the form of ED can be spread, to other populations or to other generations or even to the groups that are producing it that are willing to accept that, because they need a job and they may not have much choice in the matter of environmental regulation anyhow. So what I'm trying to point out here is, kind of like, well, this is like the who cares requirement. That's actually it's a requirement in academic research. Why are we talking about comparative advantage? Well, given their examples, at least where the world's made better off, then the world can be made better off if countries specialize in comparative advantage. Though as I said, that's not necessarily the case. Uh, Also, we want to know what the terms of trade will be. Who cares about that in itself? I couldn't tell you, but as part of learning this, we want to learn what the possible terms of trade can be between two countries once they specialize where they have the quote comparative advantage end quote. If there are we also want to know, and we've already talked about this, if there are gains from trade for both nations taken together and individually. Will each country be better off? Will the world be better off together? I'll tell you right now that other things being equal, like environmental damage, destruction, devastation, and so forth, which they patently are not. If we were in a world that were truly green, then there is no disadvantage from free trade. It's just like people trading when I talked about markets. There's always going to be an efficiency gain from trade. So I want you to understand this right now. Other things equal, ceteris paribus, other things being equal, trade itself, there's no argument made here that trade itself is ever going to be harmful to the world or to other countries. It may make no difference, but it's not going to have negative effects, even if some of the claims that comparative advantage are making are false, because given free trade, countries don't have to specialize anything. They don't have to use comparative advantage. They can just use it partially, or they can ignore it if it will not maximize their benefit. Okay, so yeah, assessment stuff here, knowing this. Oops, there we go. So let's start with how we determine who has the comparative advantage. Okay, so the first thing we want to do is make a chart. And on this chart, we want to have, let's see, if you'd like 4 columns and 3 rows. You have the good of one of the goods, another of the goods, and then the opportunity cost of one of these 2 goods. Let's just make it the second, just as a convention. So here we have each of the countries. So what we have to do here is basically, well, we actually want to start here in the 3rd row, and what we need to do is take this good, okay, and divide the amount for each country, that the amount that each country can produce of this good, by a number that will result in 1. Okay, so Portugal can produce 100, and we're not even thinking about comparative advantage of what it is right now. Just, brutally take this 100, put it there, divide it by 100, divide whatever you need to divide it by to get to 1. I think we hopefully know enough pre-algebra to do that. And again, we're talking about wine here, so we want to do this for one of the commodities. Let's just say the one in the second column. The results will not matter, whichever one you choose for this. They won't change. So 10 bottles of wine. To get to 1, we divide it by 10 bottles of wine. Then we simply take this number in the denominator that we divided by the maximum production possibility for each country for the good we decided to do this for, in this case wine, and then we just divide it by the maximum possible production of the other good. So we took 100 to get to 1 bottle of wine. We take that, we divide that into the total number of square yards of cloth possible. We get 9/10. We take that amount there, we divide it into 80, the max amount of cloth that England can produce, and we get 8. England. Okay, part 1 is done. So then you know what? The animation on this got a little bit screwy, but it doesn't really matter too much. All we're doing here is just the first phase in setting up this chart. Okay, we can do it like this and then do what I just told you for B. And then we may, if you can deal with the B chart, and that's, visually it's not too cluttered for you, you can leave it, or you can make another chart, C, where we simply put the opportunity cost of the second good in terms of 1 unit of the first good that we chose, which is in the second column. There's a reason that the first good is in the second column, by the way, which I'll get to shortly. Okay, so you see that? We take our result here and we put it here, and just to confuse you, England and Portugal got reversed here. So I think we know what we mean. Um, let's see. So, which country can produce at the lowest opportunity cost? Which country can produce wine at the lowest opportunity cost? Well, we already have the answer. See above statement about animations getting a little skew wise. Um, why is it Portugal? What is the opportunity cost of England to produce wine? One bottle of wine. Okay, and that's our opportunity cost in the simple terms that we need or want. Um, 8 yards of cloth. What's the opportunity cost to Portugal to produce one bottle of wine? It's 9/10. So who is paying the lower cost? England or Portugal? Well, obviously Portugal is paying the lower cost, and if you pay a lower cost, that's a good thing. So Portugal to produce wine. And now I will tell you the reason that this good in the further uh, right column is 1, and that is because if the ratio is expressed this way, 8 square yards of cloth to one bottle of wine, it looks exactly like a price. How much is a bottle of wine? $8. So it's $8 per one bottle. So we interpret this in terms of the trade in goods, because in economics money is a veil, and it doesn't matter here at this point in our understanding of economics. So it's just like $8 for one bottle of wine, instead 8 yards of cloth for one bottle of wine. If it's England, if it's Portugal, it's like zero point 0.9 square yards of cloth for one bottle of wine, instead of 90 cents for one bottle of wine. So it's like, which is cheaper? Portugal. So they have lower opportunity costs. They produce wine, and then once we know that, then we just say, well, if we know, via negativa, if Portugal can produce wine more cheaply, and then England can produce cloth more cheaply. So comparative advantage for wine is Portugal. Bingo. Okay, the one that is not cloth is wine. If we start getting some equalities here and stuff, it might get more complicated, but I don't expect you to know how to do that. I'm not going to give you some trick question like that. Okay, wine is in bottles. So yeah, we could flip this, and we'd come to the same conclusion. It would turn out that England is cheaper for England to produce cloth in terms of wine than it is Portugal. Okay, so now it's a little more involved, not too much. Maybe a little bit more complicated, but not too much. We want to learn what the terms of trade would be, and this is going to be a range of values. Okay, and uh, again, this is going to be a rigged example. It's assumed that the world wants is that each country, and therefore the world, is better off engaging in comparative advantage. If they are, then in theory, or caterus pure, caterus paribus, other things equal, other things being held equal, you know, the following terms of trade will be realized. Okay, so what are the terms of trade? We're familiar with this now. We're talking about comparative advantage. Okay, we have this. We've simplified the opportunity costs for each country in terms of bottles of wine. Okay. Okay, so bam, this actually really is not very complicated. It's between the opportunity cost of wine for England and the opportunity cost of wine for Portugal. Again, if we flip these around, it would come to the same thing, even though the ratios would be expressed differently. So actually super easy, right? And right, I'm just saying if we flip this, then it would just be the same values expressed in a different way. Okay, so I've already told you this whole thing's a bit wonky. Talking about whether the world's better off. I'm going to be nice to you and tell you that what I really want you to get out of this is what I've already talked about, primarily that it is not necessarily the case that comparative advantage will make either country or the world better off. A and B, in economics textbooks, they simply rig the examples to make it look that way, which bothers me because they don't tend to make that clear that they're doing that. And they say, oh, look, the world's better off, even though it may not be. Um, so, you know, economics is trying to sell you. They're trying to get you to drink this Kool-Aid, okay, to keep the world going in this rather effed up direction that it is. So, proceed with caution. Okay, one more look at Willy Wonka, the original. You can't beat an original, right? There's some covers that are better than the originals. Okay, so first, to know whether the world is better off or not, this is actually not only are they rigging where you get comparative advantage, they're also rigging the argument about whether or not the world is better off by rigging the autarky consumption examples. We can't know what autarky consumption is without utility functions. Okay, and we can't know what the terms of trade are without that. So this is another way, and you just have to know that they rig examples. I'm not asking you to know the two different ways that they rig examples, but I do want you to know that there are two different ways that they rig examples. Okay, one is to imply that countries always trade where their comparative advantage is, and the other is to rig autarky examples. So, why am I talking about rigging autarky examples? Why am I talking about autarky examples at all? Well, in order to tell us that the world is better off from comparative advantage brought on by free trade, it has to have a comparison. So it's going to compare countries that aren't trading with countries that are trading to make you think how great free trade really is, leading the world into a complete nightmare thanks to President Clinton, NAFTA, the World Trade Organization, based on these theories with rigged examples, and even more importantly, because as I said, other things equal, even if you did rig the examples, free trade can't be bad. So the real problems are the environmental damage, which does play into this course with the environmental Kuznets curve, which comes in the second to penultimate. It's a good word for you. Second to last chapter, penultimate chapter, the second to last chapter in the book. A paper was written that I don't think Chiang mentions explicitly, saying that we can destroy the environment and it'll help it later. Sounds like an abusive parent, doesn't it? In any event, that is the argument that was used to justify the environmental destruction to free trade, earth destruction, ecological devastation, now especially global climate change. The second issue, and I'm not going to call this a problem because in itself it's not necessarily a problem. We're getting into kind of a norm. You'd have to be using normative economics to say whether this is a good or a bad thing. Full confession, if it weren't for the environment, other things equal, I don't really think this is, theoretically a bad thing because it's kind of selfish to assume otherwise. What am I talking about? Okay. So the other thing I am again going to repeat that I want you to know about this in comparative advantage is that if there's free trade and there's big differences, rich country, poor country, because the lowering of the standard of living, or what Marx calls socially necessary subsistence. I'm not a big, the central notions of Marx theory are crazy AF, but Some of it's more ancillary, sort of auxiliary, sort of peripheral stuff was good. And one of those is socially necessary subsistence. So if there's a much lower level of that, I mean, in the U.S. even today, no one could even. I mean, they'd be homeless basically if they had what a poor Chinese person had that gave that person, a room. I mean, I've been in someone's apartment. It was kind of like a hallway, about 100, not even 100 feet. I say maybe 50 feet by like 10 or something like that. But it's very difficult to get that in the United States. So in any event, point being, free trade, it's not that there's a comparative advantage necessarily. I do have to make the caveat that said, Chinese workers and East Asian workers in general are far more productive than American workers for cultural reasons. Watch the movie American Factory, a documentary. I think it's still on Netflix, or the movie Gung Ho, a fictionalized movie with the same basic point to see what I'm talking about. So, in that sense, okay, I confess there is some comparative advantage going on, but I think the significant factor is that you can take capital to countries. You have to pay less wages, pay less for environmental protection because there lax enforcement. And I think some of you may be aware of that. But what I'm telling you that you're probably not aware of, and you're going to read my Slack exchange post on this. So Daily had pretty much already nailed it. I just put it maybe arguably a little bit better, but the takeaway here is when they tell us free trade is good because of comparative advantage, if there's rich countries and poor countries, it's not lowering prices because of comparative advantage. It's lowering wages from what they would have been otherwise in the home country by taking away capital from the richer, which in our case is the home country, and putting it in another country where wages are far lower, taking away jobs from the home country and giving it to the poor country. That is not comparative advantage. That is race to the bottom. Okay, and that is a result of free trade. Lastly, I mean, one more time, race to the bottom with ED, absolutely good uh, implication. But as far as with wages, it is a race to the bottom with wages too. But if you're someone who considered all humanity equal, you say, well, yeah, we're lowering wages here and causing unemployment, but we're giving jobs and wealth to, foreign countries. Go to China, they'll tell you one of the reasons they're not too negative about the communist system, at least when I was there, which was now more than 10 years ago. It was kind of like, we're eating every day what our parents or grandparents were eating once a year for Chinese New Year, which they call Spring Festival. Okay, so let's do this really quickly. All right, I don't like this very much, so I don't want to spend a lot of time on it. It's like, let's say that, you know, England can is okay. Thanks for let me gather my thoughts there. So basically, in autarky, there's no trade going on. England is sitting there and they're producing 8 square yards of cloth per hour and 9 bottles of wine per hour. Portugal is choosing for whatever reason, as I said, it's rigged to produce 72 uh, yards of cloth per hour. Actually, I'm sorry, it's rigged when how this is normally presented. I think what I'm going to do here is not rig it to show you how it has to be rigged in another example for this to work out. I think that's how I've done it. Let's see. So, in any event, what I want you to get here, England, it can produce 10 bottles of wine or 80 square yards of cloth. It's choosing to produce 8 square yards of cloth per hour and 9 bottles of wine per hour. Portugal can produce 100 bottles of wine or 90 square yards of cloth. It is choosing to produce 72 square yards of cloth and 20 bottles of wine. So how much is England consuming? As we're going to soon learn in macroeconomics, essentially, I mean, everything we produce that isn't wasted or exported we consume. So everything that is produced is consumed. It's very important to understand that about economics. Everything that is produced is consumed. So if you want to bash big corporations, there's likely a lot of truth in that, but just remember, we as a people are consuming everything that they are producing. So who benefits from that? Okay, so here, and I should have labeled that, but this is like the global consumption of each good in autarky. 80 square yards of cloth, and that is a mistake. Gosh darn it, that's bothering me here. How do I get out of this? Come on. Okay, that's better. So now in an autarky, in the arbitrary given example, there is 8 yards of cloth, square yards of cloth being consumed in England, 9 bottles of wine, 72 square yards of cloth in Portugal, 20 bottles of wine in Portugal. So the world is consuming 80 square yards of cloth and 29 bottles of wine. Okay, so, wow, look. We have exactly the same amount of square yards of. No, we have exactly the same square yards of cloth in free trade as an autarky, but we get 71 more bottles of wine. See, look, isn't, you know, comparative advantage from free trade great? We've just proved it, right? Well, let's see. So, right, that was the question. Okay, let you read this, even though I've just said it. So just keep in mind that other things equal, which they are not in this world. Free trade in itself cannot be bad because countries can do whatever is best for them as far as comparative advantage or not. And in reality, they'll probably, like there may be some partial comparative advantage. Make some stuff at home, trade some of it, so forth. Okay, so let's look at this example. I'm going to kind of cut to the chase here. So look at this example here. Under autarky, this is if England had been consuming a more realistic amount of cloth per hour compared to wine. Okay, and the example for Portugal was already pretty realistic. So under a more realistic example, look what happens. I'll go back here. There we go. Under autarky, 128. The world is consuming 128 square yards of cloth and 23 bottles of wine. And then we have free trade, and I should put with free trade not just free trade in this and in the previous slide, but with free trade and comparative advantage, then we're actually consuming fewer square yards of cloth, but more bottles of wine. Does that make the world better off? We'd have to know what the utility functions of each of these are. So they occlude these examples from you in economics textbooks generally to sell comparative advantage. Though, given this alone, it would still mean that free trade is the best policy. Even if but the point is here that even though free trade were the best policy, and this is assuming that capital isn't mobile and there's no, green damage. When I say other things equal in this context, that's what I mean. Capital is not mobile. Um, and if there were free trade, it's not necessarily the case that countries would engage in comparative advantage. You'd have to rig the examples to get to that conclusion per se. It would depend on the utility function or taste and preferences for cloth and wine in England and Portugal, respectively. So, yeah, we don't know. Okay, so okay, so I'm gonna let you read this. Okay, so these are all production possibility frontiers in these absolute comparative advantage examples. So notice how the production possibility frontier of Japan changes as capital leaves Japan, it decreases and enters China, drawn by cheaper labor and or environmental standards, increasing China's ability to produce flat screen TVs versus rice. So Japan can now produce fewer flat screen TVs versus bushels of rice, and China can now produce more flat screen TVs versus bushels of rice. So if there's capital mobility, free trade can hurt one country and help another one, as more valuable production may shift with capital from one country to another one. And again, note here, this in itself is something that can change the production possibilities frontier. Chiang calls it on pages 39 through 40 a change in resources. You'll see this in the lecture on free capital mobility and the effect on wages in the home and foreign country in question, the poorer country and the versus the wealthier country, which is in our case the home country. So be aware of that. Okay, another thing that can change the production possibility frontier, change in resources, but I'm focusing on capital. And it can also and labor from the other one. Those are two things. Also very important here. These are changes that occur in a static time equilibrium. Probably wouldn't all this would not all probably happen in 1 hour. Actually, this PPT represents the change that could happen in 1 hour. So um, it's a little difficult to explain here, but we are talking about a static equilibrium. Simply if there's this change in capital from fewer prices, there'll be this change in production possibilities. That's different than, say, if we saved and we needed time to pass. We're making money from the passage of time from the savings because of growth processes. And that's also true, at least how I'm defining it, for technology. So be aware of that. When technology changes, we're saying in this, in the way I'm examining it, that is time dynamic. In the way that I want you to understand it, it happens. It's time dependent. Time has to pass. Time periods have to change for this to happen. Um, this is all something that can happen in one time period. It's not motivated by time. It's motivated by something cheaper. I mean, cheaper wages drawing capital out of the wealthier country with higher wages to the country with a lower social necessary subsistence. Okay, and one last note. When I was recording this, I have the mouse, it was not being picked up on, so I thought I was pointing to things with the mouse, like looky here, and I wasn't. So you're not going to see any mouse move to where I tell you to look, but I think it's not going to do any real harm, and you'll know what I'm talking about. Okay, have a good one.